Greetings all, and welcome to the mid-month update for March of 2023. This is a publicly distributed video, so feel free to share it. Normally, this only goes out to my Patreon subscribers, but because this month has been such an astrologically active month, I am sharing this with everyone. Before we get into the material, I have a couple of things I'd like to mention, and I'm going to go through these rather quickly. There will be links in the top comment below, so that these active links, you can click on them there and find out more information if you would like. I would like to remind everyone that there is still registration open for the Third International Astrology Congress that is being sponsored by the Portuguese Association of Astrologers. And this is in the Azores. The Azores Islands are about 1,000 miles off the coast of Portugal. They're a very magical place, and this conference is going to feature more than 25 astrologers from Portugal and South America and the United States and Canada and Europe. There are registrations still available, and that is the weekend of March 31st, April 1st, and 2nd. That's coming up pretty quickly, but it's going to be a very, very exciting weekend. The next thing I want to mention is something I've been talking about for a while, and it's kind of come together in a very powerful way, but it's coming up on us pretty quickly. And this is Astro Tulum, and this is a conference that I'll be hosting, and it's going to be in Tulum, Mexico, and it's going to be 7 days of astrology masterclasses and interactive workshops. I'll obviously be the frontline presenter at this for several of the days. Also, there will be a Mayan astrologer, Aisha Cosmos, and Philip Daniel Miles will also be there, British astrologer. And this is being held at the Amansala Resort, which is this incredibly magical place south of Tulum that is an all-inclusive retreat center, and it's magical, it's beautiful, it's on the beach, and it's known for its luxurious eco-chic accommodations, and you can stay at the conference venue. The rooms there are a huge range from approximately $90 a night all the way up to $1,000 a night for these amazing suites that are right on the beach. And if you don't want to stay at the facility there are other places nearby, and that is going to be it's a week-long conference, and it'll be April 22nd to the 28th. I know this is coming up pretty quickly, and it's short notice for many people, but if you can get away for a week, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be doing a tour of the eighth wonder of the world, the Mayan ruins. And so registration is open for this. Information is available at the link in the comments below. The next thing coming up on my calendar is going to be Astrology, Consciousness, and the Great Shift. And this is going to be at the amazing, very, very well-known Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, north of New York City. And I'm going to be sharing this weekend, this special weekend conference, with Maurice Fernandez, Lynn Bell, Rachel Lang, and Ann Ortely. And it's going to be a full-packed weekend of different perspectives on what's going on now astrologically and why these times are so important. Whether you're a full-time professional practicing astrologer, an amateur astrologer, or even just someone interested in astrology, this information will be accessible to everyone at all levels, and information also can be found at the link below, and that's at Omega Institute, the weekend of June 30th through July 2nd. Technically, that's July 4th weekend, although it's June 30th through July 2nd, and I'll see many of you there. Incidentally, I'll be doing another weekend workshop at the Omega Institute with Rachel Lang on the weekend of October 13th through the 15th. Registration isn't open for that yet, but that will be a weekend all about Venus, Venus ritual, Venus understanding, working with Venus in our lives and the astrology of Venus, and I'll have more information on that as time goes on. The last thing I want to mention before I get into the material for the day is something I've mentioned already before, and this is the 10-day retreat that I'll be leading, an initiation into astrology, December 6th through the 16th. In Goa, India. Goa is on the Malabar coast. It's about maybe 2/3 of the way down the west coast of India, on the Arabian Sea, south of Mumbai. It's an incredibly magical place. It's a place at which I've taught before. The venue is an Ayurvedic healing center and yoga retreat center, just a few-minute walk down to the beach. We already have registrations filling up for that. We will take over the whole facility, and it's going to be an amazing week. And information for that is available at the link below at heavenandearthworkshops.com. And Heaven and Earth Workshops have sponsored and put on the various workshops that I've done around the world, in Bali, in India, in Mexico, and they really do an amazing job, and I'm so excited about this. And if you're thinking about this, check it out, because Goa, India is an amazing place. If you've never been to India and it seems like it might be overwhelming, Goa is a good place to make an entry into India. I sometimes refer to it as India Light, because it's just much more accessible and easier to move around than some other places in India are for Westerners. And this is going to be a fantastic week-long, actually 10-day-long event, and I look forward to seeing many of you there. Okay, that's it for that for now. And I should also mention, though, before we move on, that NORWAC, which is on Memorial Day weekend, which is the last weekend in May here in the United States, although I'm not speaking at NORWAC this year, I'm I speak there often over the years, but I will be there, and I will be hosting a little party get-together on Saturday night for my Patreon subscribers and other people who would like to join us, and I'll have more information about that little get-together at NORWAC, and I'll see many of you there. NORWAC is the Northwest Astrological Conference, and it's in Seattle, Washington. Okay, now on to the real show. We are here today to talk about the astrology of the second part of March. I am recording this on the afternoon of March 17th, Friday, March 17th, and we're going to be looking at the last couple of weeks of March up through April 1st. And March, as all of you know, has been already an incredibly profound and powerful month astrologically. We are now in the beginning throes of Saturn having moved into Pisces. Saturn having been in its home signs of Capricorn and Aquarius for almost the past 6 years. Saturn now having moved into Pisces actually on March 7th is the beginning of the next phase of where we are at culturally. And I think we've already seen some inklings of what it is that is on stage for us. But of course, the real change that many people have been looking for in March is when Pluto first tips its cosmic toes into the Aquarian pond, if you will. And that occurs on March 23rd. And we'll have a bunch more to say about that in a few minutes, but we'll have a lot more to say to that over the weeks and months ahead, even though we're just getting a taste of what Pluto in Aquarius will be about, because Pluto only stays in Aquarius for a couple months, then it retrogrades back into Capricorn, then back into Aquarius early next year in 2024, where it stays for much of the year and just touches back into Capricorn again, and then finally stays in Aquarius for 2 decades. And so we're going to have quite a run of Pluto in Aquarius. But right now, as of the middle of March, I think we're getting some of the last, how do I want to say this? The last reactions to Pluto in Capricorn, including the recent bank failures in the United States, that could be a signal of other things to happen. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that also as we move toward the end of the month, as Pluto moves into Aquarius. But I think that Pluto moving into Aquarius combined with Saturn moving into Pisces really sets us up for a huge change this month. And so I really wanted to address some of these changes, and we're going to take the month now day by day through the end of the month, and then we will pick it up in the overview of April as we get to the first of next month. So to begin with, we are looking at a chart for noon on March 17th, and we can see that the moon has just moved into Aquarius. And in fact, the moon, having come through Capricorn, lined up with Pluto, and the moon conjunction to Pluto was early this morning. And whenever I say today or this morning, I'm referring to the chart that we are looking at this on the screen. These charts, as you know, for those of you who watch these on a regular basis, these charts are always Aries rising charts, which means that you can be watching this from anywhere in the world. And as long as you adjust your time zone from noon to where you are, the planet is always in the exact right position, but without respect to the horizon, because as we move around the Earth, obviously, the horizon changes. What's noon for me here in Seattle, with the sun directly overhead, may be the middle of night or early tomorrow morning. In fact, if you're in Australia, let's say. So we are looking at a chart for noon of March 17th, and we can see that the moon has just moved into Aquarius, and the Aquarius moon is picking up on squares to Venus in Taurus and Uranus in Taurus. The square to Venus will occur, already occurred this morning, but the square to Uranus will occur tomorrow morning, and that's Saturday morning on March 18th at just before 10 a.m. Seattle time. The more important thing today, though, is that Venus, having just moved into Taurus, and Venus moved into Taurus yesterday on Thursday in the mid-afternoon, Seattle time, 3:34 actually. Venus now at 1 degree of Taurus is making a sextile to Saturn at 1 degree of Pisces. And a Venus-Saturn sextile is actually as good as it gets for Saturn. There's a sense of being grounded in our desires, in our wants, in our sense of what is beautiful and what is aesthetically pleasing. It's like when we reach out for those things today, they may seem to be more real than they usually are. Nevertheless, remember that we're still working on a waning square from the moon to, I should say, a separating square from the moon to Venus, so there still may be a little angst around those issues. And in fact, we're also working on a separating square between Mercury and Mars, but that square is still within orb. And so there is some angst today, some conflict around issues in general. However, Venus sextiling to Saturn ultimately really can sweeten the day and can suggest that that we could get what we want today. Saturday, whatever that means. It may not be as flashy as some other aspects, but on a deep and sustaining level, I think that the Venus sextile to Saturn is significant and important. And by the way, that aspect is exact at 3:25 p.m. Seattle time on Friday. As we move to Saturday, we have the moon making that square to Uranus in the morning, but we also have Mercury making a sextile with Pluto, and that's not until evening time, about 8:23 is when it's exact. But now we're able to go deeper. We're able to communicate things that are important and able to communicate them in a way that brings things up that normally may be hidden, that when we bring them up, they're not as problematic as they might be at other times. We also are eager to bring things up out into the open, not only because Mercury is making that sextile to Pluto. Remember, Pluto is at the very, very, very end, the anaretic degree, where things begin to change. Pluto is at that very last degree. It's at 29 degrees Capricorn in 54 minutes, just 6 minutes of orb away from being in the new sign of Aquarius, which it will be within the week. But we also have Mercury, as it's making that sextile to Pluto at 8:23 p.m. today. It also then Mercury moves into Aries just an hour later, actually at 9:24 p.m. And when Mercury moves into Aries, we say it first and then we think what we should say. In other words, we lose the ability with Mercury and Aries to logically, rationally think about what we should say and what we shouldn't say. And instead of delivering finished messages, our communication becomes more in the moment, more spur of the moment, more impulsive. If something shoots across our mind, chances are, given the opportunity, we'll blurt it out, and then we'll go, oh, well, gee, maybe I shouldn't have said that. But sometimes it's very important because this brings things out that otherwise might be hidden. So Saturday, as Saturday develops, we're definitely getting a hit from this Mercury, first sextiling Pluto and then actually moving into Aries, that we will be feeling for days to come. And on Sunday, the 19th, the moon starts off very early in the morning, 3:33, in fact, a.m. Seattle time. The moon makes a trine with Mars, which actually, for those of us who live in places where we are awake and maybe even out of bed, this may actually compel us to do something and say something in that moment while that moon trines Mars and stimulates the energy of action. But by 8:11 a.m., the moon moves from Aquarius into Pisces, where it will join up with Saturn by 10:27 a.m. And this is a different flavor. It's almost like if we didn't say it yesterday, or we didn't say it last night, or we didn't say it very, very, very early in the morning, we may think better about it and not say it at all. In fact, when that moon moves into Pisces and joins up with Saturn, we might feel less certain about ourselves. We might feel less confident. We might feel restricted in some way. But as the day progresses, Mercury makes a half square, that's a semi-square, with Uranus. And again, we're dealing with this back and forth nature of kind of say it. Mercury and Aries, and then the Saturn energy of maybe we should hold on and be more cautious. And then as Mercury makes that half square with Uranus at 12:15 p.m., boom, we get another chance to blurt out something like lightning striking and relieve the tension and express something that maybe is, more logically not expressed. And yet, once we express something, once we say something, we certainly cannot take it back. Now, in some ways, all of this is setting us up for these larger changes of the spring equinox that's in the northern hemisphere, the autumnal equinox in the southern hemisphere. But on Sunday, March 19th, we have the sun at pushing 29 degrees of Pisces. So if we move the chart ahead to March 20th, at noon, the sun is still showing at 29 degrees of Pisces and 54 minutes. And Pluto is at 29 degrees of Capricorn and 56 minutes. We're getting a sun sextiling Pluto. And this is profound and deep, but I think this is more about kind of feeling comfortable with what has happened in the past or what still needs to happen that still is tied to the past, because it's not until the sun moves into Aries at 2:24 p.m. Seattle time, West Coast Pacific Standard Time, Pacific Daylight Time. It's not until the sun moves into Aries at 2:24 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time that we get the blast of what's coming. And now, as the sun moves into Aries at that equinox moment, this also is, we'll feel more about the communication aspect of Mercury having moved into Aries, because even though the sun is still 3 degrees away from being in an exact conjunction with Mercury, the fact of the matter is that when they're both in the same sign, we're feeling really connected to that expressive energy, to that energy of Mercury being lined up with the sun. And even though right now Mercury is moving faster than the sun, the fact is that we will feel that energy impulsively. And in fact, we're coming into the new moon, which is exact tomorrow being the 21st. And I'm going to move the chart ahead to the 21st, and we'll see that by the 21st at noon, not only the sun is now pushing toward 1 degree of Aries, but the moon is now past the sun at 1 degree and 48 minutes. And so we're going to back this up to 10:23 a.m. for a moment and look at the exact new moon in Aries, which to some people, this is considered for many people, the real beginning of the new year. Now, the new year is an astrological event. The calendar new year on January 1st that occurs in Capricorn is more about the structure and the order of our calendaring system. But the new year itself in the Chinese calendar is the new moon in Aquarius, where we're kind of anticipating the spring. But for many people, it's the spring, the equinox new moon that is the beginning of the new year. Interestingly enough, many calendars use the new moon in Libra, which is around the Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the new moon in the Hebrew calendar. But here we have the Aries lunation, and this in some ways sets the stage for the entire year ahead, and certainly the month ahead. This is the newest of all the new moons because it occurs in the sign that is the newest sign. It is the sign that is at the beginning of every cycle. Aries is the sprouting, germinating seed that you can't even tell the difference between a sprouting acorn and a sprouting daisy. It's just that initial impulse of energy pushing forward. And so what we have on March 21st at this Aries new moon, with Mercury in Aries and Jupiter and Chiron in Aries, just coming away from that exact Jupiter-Chiron conjunction that's still playing. It's still close enough in orb. It's less than 2 degrees of orb, and we're still getting the feeling of the opportunities that we have in order to heal, in order to forgive, the ability to accept someone else's forgiveness and to let old things go so we can move into the future. We have to let the past go in order to move into the future. And this new moon is all about that. And even with Saturn new in maybe what's considered the oldest sign of Pisces, because it's the last sign in the zodiac, there's still things that are holding us back. And of course, we have that Pluto still holding on at 29 degrees and 58 minutes. Just 2 minutes of arc now. That's 1/30th of a degree away from being at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And although the cutoffs between signs, the cusps, are pretty clean compared to the orbs that we use for aspects or for maybe house divisions. When we look at the divisions between signs, those divisions are pretty clean. However, we are already getting signs of Pluto in Aquarius that began over the last couple of years even, not only with Saturn moving through Aquarius, but with Saturn squaring on and off to Uranus, and then other planets moving through Aquarius, and then this new moon in Aquarius a couple months ago. And so we're getting flavors of this. And again, this is not to be confused with the age of Aquarius, which is likely still at least a century away. But the point here is that this new moon in Aries is giving us the seed to plant the intentions which actually break away from the past and push us into the future. It's significant that this new moon is squaring Mars, although it's just past the square to Mars at the end of Gemini, and so we have the sun squaring Mars and the moon squaring Mars both prior to that new moon, to the new moon, and yet they're significant. I mean, the moon squares Mars at nearly 6 a.m. The moon actually moves into Aries at 9 a.m. this morning, and then the new moon occurs at 10:23 a.m. The moon also conjoined Neptune in late Pisces, very late last night or early this morning at 1:19 a.m. This is a huge transition, and the most important thing about it is how close it is to the spring equinox. This is incredibly rare to have the sun move into Aries and have that equinox, the astrological new year, technically kick off, and then being rebooted, restimulated by the new moon in Aries, in a way starting that whole newness all over again. This is incredibly powerful. But the other thing to note here is that both the new moon and the sun, therefore, are both making a half square with Uranus. In other words, Uranus at 16 degrees of Taurus is basically a half a sign plus a full sign. In other words, 30 degrees. That would bring us to 1 degree of Taurus from the sun and moon, at 1 degree of Aries, or at 0 degrees of Aries, just barely 1 degree. And then that would bring us to about 1 degree of Taurus, and then another 15 degrees, which is a half a sign, would bring us to 16 degrees of Taurus. And so we have this exciting new moon that has this electric feel to it, because it's almost like there's too much too fast. Things are happening so quickly that we almost want to slow things down, but that is not necessarily a good idea now, especially since by tomorrow, by Wednesday, the 22nd, the moon moving through Aries actually catches up with Chiron and Jupiter, reinforcing the power of this learning and having our consciousness expanded by being pushed into the future, whether or not we want to go. Remember, there's a lot of energy that is going around the globe that is fear of the future, and many people are wanting to hold on to the past or return to some time in the past where things were allegedly better, whether or not they actually were. This new moon that is followed up by the moon's conjunction to Chiron and Jupiter on the 22nd, on Wednesday, are reminders that we're not able to hold the past at bay. And in fact, Pluto, at now 29 degrees of Capricorn and 59 minutes at midday on the 22nd, by the 23rd midday, that Pluto has moved into 0 degrees of Aquarius for the first time since the American and French revolutions. That's the first time that we're experiencing Pluto in Aquarius. Pluto, the planet of deconstruction, reconstruction. Pluto, the planet of death and rebirth. Pluto, last time round in Aquarius, was the death of one type of governmental social structure based upon monarchies, based upon royalty inheriting the power, and the beginning of the dream that occurred in the French Revolution of the individual against that royal system, and in fact even the American Revolution that began as as a revolution of the people against the royalty or monarchy that ruled England and the British Empire. Now, we've obviously got a long way to go, but we've come a long way from where we were. And I think as Pluto moves through Aquarius over the next couple of decades, we will see amazing and huge and powerful and sometimes not comfortable shifts again as the social structure, that's Aquarius, as the global community, that's Aquarius, as humanity itself, that's Aquarius, as the highest ideals and conceptions that the human mind can make in air. Aquarius is an air sign. These will all undergo this nihilistic death and rebirth. And we've seen the inklings of this over the last years. In fact, we've been seeing the inklings of this since the early 60s when we had 7 planets moving through Aquarius in February of 1962. And again, these are all beginnings of a much larger transition that even those of us who consider ourselves futurists or visionaries, we can't quite grasp the power of the dynamics of the changes that will occur as Pluto moves through Aquarius, in a way still being a harbinger of what the Aquarian age will be some 100 years from now. Humanity may not be what we want it to be or think it should be, but evolution will continue to evolve, whether or not we are on board individually. So here we have Pluto having moved into Aquarius, and in fact what we have also today on March 23rd, on Thursday the 23rd, we have the moon moving into Taurus. What does that mean? It means that as Pluto moves into Aquarius, the moon is giving it a square going, this may not be all as comfortable as we wish it were. In fact, the moon square Pluto occurs at 11:42 a.m. Pacific time. And thankfully, just a few hours later, almost 3 o'clock, 3 p.m., 2:56 actually, the moon makes a sextile with Saturn. And that sextile with Saturn gives us a little bit of breathing room, and it helps us ground the energy a bit. I won't be surprised if there are some events that occur on Thursday and Friday when Pluto moves into Aquarius. But I think that we're looking at these events as harbingers or as bellwethers of the larger events that have yet to occur and that will take time to unfold. Nevertheless, I wouldn't downplay the possibility of some major news breaking on some levels globally and or things happening in our individual lives that may be inklings of things to occur around the bend. On Friday, the 24th, we have the moon moving through Taurus, catching up with Venus in the early morning and with Uranus later in the afternoon. The moon conjoins Venus at 3:30 a.m. and it joins up with Uranus at 4:51 p.m., all Pacific time, of course. Other than that, it's a relatively quiet day. We do have a quintile from Mercury to Pluto, which could stimulate some deep conversations as the day goes on. I don't often bring quintiles and other harmonic aspects into the mundane astrology that I do here, but when there's nothing else going on, they can act as a hook. And so I would note that this Mercury quintile Pluto is exact at 9:08 p.m. on Friday the 24th. By early Saturday morning, that is the 25th, Mars actually changes signs and moves into Cancer. Remember, Mars has been in Gemini since August of last year, since August of 2022. And Mars turned retrograde, and it was retrograde all of November, December, turned direct again in mid-January. But Mars, since mid-January, has been moving back through its shadow territory and has recently moved out of its shadow and is now moving into a new sign. Traditionally, Mars is not a happy camper in Cancer, although I would suggest that some of that has to do with patriarchal judgment of Mars being the god of war and therefore should be eager to go out and conquer and rape and pillage and militarily flex its muscles and show its macho-ness, when the fact of the matter is that Mars in Cancer is not interested in those kinds of things. It's more interested in protecting home and family and creating boundaries that protect one's own emotional state of being. Now, it still can be very powerful because we can get so afraid that our family or our traditions or our values, our family values, or our homeland is being threatened, that can in fact stimulate us to go out and beat up someone else preemptively so that they don't come and get us if we're fearful enough. But the point here is that as Mars moves into Cancer, there is a little bit of pulling back of the energy, or maybe internalizing it. We can still be angry, and that anger can come out, but it often comes out as a passive aggression rather than in Gemini, where it can be a war of words. And we've certainly seen that war of words over the past months with Mars in Gemini, of people kind of spitting their venom out into the public and us having to deal with it. But Mars moving into Cancer it does something else, and that is, and this is something that has actually been cooking for several days, because Mars has been making a quincunx with Pluto at the end of Capricorn. The exact quincunx between Mars and Pluto occurs at 6:33 a.m. this morning, on Saturday morning, just an hour and a half, almost 2 hours after Mars moves into Cancer at 4:45 a.m. So here's the deal. Mars is moving faster than Pluto. Pluto moved into Aquarius on Thursday morning, and Mars is still at the very, very end of Gemini. Now, Mars and Pluto have been in this very, very close dance of this quincunx, where these energies are not getting along. They're hard for each of them to find one another to create a relationship. And now, as Pluto moves into Aquarius, and then Mars moves into Cancer, Mars makes that exact quincunx just a couple of hours after it moves into Cancer, reinforcing the idea that these deeper death rebirth, this deeper deconstruction, this deeper ending of whatever it is that needs to go in our whole view of the future, what we need to let go of, Mars in Cancer doesn't want to. Mars in Cancer wants to hold on to the family and the tradition and its origins, and it doesn't necessarily want to let go. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, and especially because by mid-afternoon, what happens is the moon moves out of Taurus into Gemini, almost re-stimulating all the verbal energy that Mars had for the past 7-8 months as it was moving through Gemini. And then the moon makes a trine with Pluto late this afternoon at 5:46 p.m. And then it makes a square with Saturn. And it's almost like we're getting this juxtaposition of all these energies now at the beginning of signs rather than the end of signs. In other words, we have Pluto at the beginning of Aquarius, we have Mars at the beginning of Cancer, we have Saturn at the beginning of Pisces, we have the Sun at the beginning of Aries, and we have the Moon moving through the beginning of Gemini, tying all these things up again in a lot of dynamic energy. I think the 25th is going to be quite powerful, and there'll be a bit of confusion mixed into it because Venus also this morning at 9:10 a.m. exactly makes a half square with Neptune, which can re-stimulate some of the energy that we have come out of back around March 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, when we had this cluster of Mercury, Sun, and Neptune all squaring Mars. Mercury, Sun, and Neptune toward the end of Pisces squaring Mars, just moving out of its shadow at about 25 degrees of Gemini at that point in time. But now everything has changed, and yet we get kind of this throwback that's just a little bit of like, all this stuff is new. This is all different. We're having to adjust to it. But there's still this element of being able to fantasize about something that may or may not be real. By Sunday, we have Mercury now moving through Aries that catches up with Chiron, and this is an excellent day to speak our piece, especially when it comes to true forgiveness, in honestly confronting something that we've held on to, in basically, often when we're forgiving others, what we're really doing is freeing ourselves from the entanglement of some issue in the past. Freeing ourselves is not just about going up to someone and saying, it's okay, I forgive you. It's about feeling in our heart that we're not attached to whatever it is that happened at some time in the past. This is a great time, again, because all of this is occurring in Aries, of focusing on the moment rather than hanging on to the past. Granted, it can be a bit confusing here because Mars is the planet of Aries. It's doing Aries work, and it's in Cancer, and it's holding on to the past in some way. But with the Sun moving through Aries at in its exaltation, with Mercury lining up with Chiron today early, and tomorrow later in the day lining up with Jupiter, conjoining Jupiter on Monday at 11:50 p.m., we're getting this incredible buzz off this Mercury, and even tomorrow, we're looking still at Sunday the 26th, where we can see how close Mercury is to Chiron. But when we go to the 27th, and we can see Mercury approaching its conjunction to Jupiter, which doesn't happen until almost midnight, 11:50 p.m. But we're getting this all day with Mercury right in between Chiron and Jupiter. And yet we also get this morning, we're actually just midday, we're also getting Mercury making a half square to Saturn. And so it's not easy for us to just speak our mind and to go to this wider growth-oriented place. Remember, we're also getting a play throughout this month, and I talked about this in the March forecast. I talked about the semi-square from Jupiter to Saturn, which was exact on the 21st. We didn't talk about it specifically on the 21st because this is something that's been with us for pretty much most of the month. I spoke about it in depth, or in from a deeper perspective, and how this related or relates back to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius back around Christmas time of 2020, what was called the Great Conjunction, because it was the great mutation of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction into air. And now that Jupiter is making this half square to Saturn, again, that was exact almost a week ago on Tuesday, the 21st, is still so closely within orb that Mercury making its conjunction with Jupiter, therefore, is making its half square with Saturn. Chiron, Mercury, and Jupiter, all in Aries, still need to answer to the authority, the structure. We're not just getting away with something scot-free by going, I forgive myself, I forgive you, I'm healed, you're healed, everything's cool. No, we still have to deal with what? Saturn in Pisces, the reality of our emotions, the reality of the vibes that linger in the ripples in water that aren't just mysteriously banished or mysteriously vanish just because we get a good idea. It's been said that we humans sometimes forget that our nervous system exists in our brain and in our heart, that there's a whole section of the heart that actually is nerve cells like the brain, and that cerebral mental thinking action doesn't control what goes on in the heart. And I think that Saturn in Pisces is a constant reminder for the next couple of years that it's not just about thinking our way out of the wet paper bag. We actually also have to go into the emotions, into the feeling, into the belief structures, into the things that are very subtle, that are more about the experiences of the heart rather than only the experiences of the head. And in some ways, this goes back to Pluto and Aquarius, which in some ways needs to deconstruct or take down the idea that the conception of what we have is the ultimate truth, because those conceptions need to be deconstructed or destroyed in order for us to be freed from what we thought, which wasn't necessarily the truth, but was a truth for a period of time, so that we now can rebuild them in ways that are more relevant and more useful to our current state of being. So, back to the 27th, we have the moon moving through Gemini, and we have and of course the moon moving through Gemini also makes its square to Neptune by evening time. And it also makes a conjunction, Mercury makes a conjunction with Jupiter exactly as we mentioned earlier, by midnight tonight. And this can be very, very powerful, but we don't get to do it without acknowledging the structures and the emotional reality of Saturn in Pisces. Okay, on to the 28th. Early in the morning on the 28th, and when I say early in the morning, I mean 3:22 a.m. Seattle time. So for many people, this will happen actually late on Monday night, depending upon where you are in the world. But the moon moves into Cancer at 3:22 a.m. And what else just recently moved into Cancer? Oh, Mars. What does that mean? It means that the moon, as it moves into Cancer, will make that quincunx with Pluto, and then it will, at 6:19 a.m., conjoin Mars. The moon will, as it conjoins Mars, can stir up feelings of anger, of boundary, of need to somehow put someone away from our place of threatening, a place where we feel threatened. We need to stabilize our boundaries and maybe even push someone away. We need to be clear about those boundaries. The good news is that by 8:03 a.m., the moon makes a trine with Saturn, and this enables us to be very clear about what those boundaries are. And by the way, this is a bit of foreshadowing, because the moon, moving faster than Mars, joins up with Mars at, like I said, 3:22 a.m. It moves into Cancer at 3:22 a.m., joins up with Mars at 6:19 a.m., and then makes its trine with Saturn at 8:03 a.m. And what this means is that Mars, coming right behind the moon, will make its trine with Saturn on the 30th, on Thursday, the 30th. And we'll get there in just a moment. But right now, sticking with this energy of Mars being joined up by the moon, and that being emphasized, and us being maybe a little bit hot under the collar. Maybe we can get angrier. Maybe we can find ourselves in an ego skirmish that maybe isn't about what it appears to be about. because somehow someone got us upset about something, but we're not upset about what's going on in the moment. We're upset about what that stimulated, some memory that all of a sudden comes to the front and boom, and we can get angry, or we can even get a rash, because that's a Mars inflation, inflammatory kind of a thing. And yet at the same time that the moon is lining up with Mars, and this is on the morning of Tuesday morning, the 28th, Mars is also making a half square with Uranus. Now, remember, we had planets making a half square with Uranus from the other side as they were going into Aries, because that's a sign and a half. That's a sign is 30 degrees, and a half a sign is 15 degrees. 45 degrees is a half square. So from 0 degrees of Aries to 15 degrees of Taurus is a half square. And now we have Uranus at 16, almost 17 degrees of Taurus. So that to 1 degree of Gemini is a half of a sign, and then to 1 degree of Cancer is another sign. So we now have Mars making a half of a square, or a sign and a half, 45 degree aspect, 45 degree angle, a semi-square, to Uranus. And this can be incredibly stimulating, incredibly action producing. This occurs at 1:40 p.m. But I think Tuesday is going to be an interesting day, because there's being so much stimulated by the moon lining up with Mars, and the moon making its half square, first with Venus and then with Uranus, and with the conjuncts to Pluto, and then with Mars making its half square to Uranus, and all of that being somewhat contained by not only the moon trining Saturn, but Mars coming into its trine to Saturn over the next couple of days. This is going to be a very intriguing dynamic to unfold, especially because the moon is making an opening square. The moon in Cancer squares the sun in Aries. And for those of you who know my chart, you know that I have a Cancer moon square my sun in Aries. So this is kind of like a recurring aspect for me, this opening square of the moon to the sun that occurs at 7:32 p.m. on Tuesday, March 28th. And by the 29th, we have the moon moving through Cancer, making its square to Chiron, to Jupiter, to Mercury. And these are all occurring in the middle of the day. Well, actually, the square to Mercury doesn't occur till later in the evening. But Wednesday is all about the dynamics of the wanting to act out there in the real world, and yet holding things in, because that moon in Cancer isn't sure if it really should say what's on its mind, or what it's feeling. By the 30th, we have the moon moving through the latter degrees of Cancer. And as the moon moves through the latter degrees of Cancer, it makes a trine with Neptune. But we have Mars by the middle of the day, actually just a few moments after noon, Mars at 2 degrees of Cancer and 36 minutes is making an exact trine to Saturn at 2 degrees of Pisces and 36 minutes. This is exact at 12:03 p.m. And although traditionally Mars and Saturn are malefics, they're difficult planets. When difficult planets make a smooth aspect, does that give them the ability to be even more difficult? Or does that suggest that we might be able to make better use of the energies? I think often the latter, but we will see over the few days around the end of March and the first few days of April as to how this plays out, because we get a very strong balancing, or an ability to harmonize that energy of Mars in Cancer with Saturn in Pisces. And what exactly does this mean? I think in some ways, really what this means is that we can organize, that would be a Saturnian thing, through what we do or don't do. Because remember, Mars in Cancer often expresses itself not by overt actions out there, but by what it doesn't say, what it holds in, what it cool, calm, and collected about because it's waiting for a right moment to act. As if that wasn't enough for one day, not only does Mars trine Saturn, giving us this ability to somehow infuse Saturn and Mars with a bit of equilibrium so that we can actually physically put our emotions into some sort of work structurally that leaves a residue. That's not the right word. An enduring something in the material realm. It allows us to do something that endures. That's a concretization. It's concrete action, even though it's based ultimately upon emotion here. But at the same time, we have Venus joining up with Uranus, and that occurs just moments after the Mars trine Saturn. Well, it's exact a few hours later, but it's so close that Venus lining up with Uranus at 16 degrees of Taurus. And again, there's that whole half square that is happening between Mars and Uranus, and of course Venus and Mars now also, Uranus, Mars, Venus, Mars, that it's not all that comfortable and it's exciting, but again, it has to do with what we express versus what we don't express. Because Venus conjoined with Uranus is this attraction and desire for something out of the box. It's like being freed from the social norms that would usually prevent us from wanting something or liking something. Now, just because we're attracted to something doesn't mean we need to physically go after it. And in fact, I would suggest that Mars in Cancer will tend to prevent us from going after it like crazy. However, Mars in Cancer pulls that energy in, and the trine to Saturn, I think it allows us to express these unusual wants and desires, this need for making change in our value structure and for breaking away from the past in some manner of moving into the future in Taurus in a stable manner, and with Mars trine Saturn adding to that stability. So we'll see what happens at the end of the month. Now, I should also mention that within a few minutes of the exact Venus conjunct Uranus, which occurs exactly at 3:25 p.m. Pacific time, that at 3:31 p.m., just a few minutes later, the moon moves from Cancer into Leo. And again, this is about outward expression. And so we're seeing all of a sudden this stuff maybe that we've been holding in flies out into the open. But what happens when the moon moves from Cancer into Leo? Well, it exactly opposes Pluto, which has just moved opposite from Capricorn into Aquarius. And so we don't get to express what our feelings are without having some plutonic reaction from the social structure, from the outer world, from the Aquarian realm. This is an incredible dynamic period of time that by the 31st, I think the energy can begin to settle down a little bit, even though the moon is still moving through Leo. The moon moving through Leo will pick up on a trine to the sun in Aries. That's exact midday on Friday the 31st. And I think that can be very sweet. But we also have Venus making a half square with Mars. Remember that Mars and the Venus-Uranus conjunction have been moving in and out of half squares, and this stirs up a bit of action and a bit of conflict. So we have a very dynamic close to the month. And I think it's very significant that just to remind us that in the March overview, I said March was in like a lamb and out like a lion this year because we began the month with a Venus-Jupiter conjunction and we end it with a Venus-Uranus conjunction. It's more complicated than that, obviously. And by the end of the month, we see the moon moving through Leo and then into Virgo. And by April 5th, we have a full moon, and that full moon is in Libra. And we also have Mercury that's at the very end of Aries, that by April 3rd move into Taurus, making a square with Pluto. We have a lot of changes still coming up, and some of the changes that began in March really kind of ground themselves and seat themselves in April. And it may take until April until we really get to see fully what happened in March. But I think this last week and a half or two of March is going to be quite powerful. And with that, I'm going to end today's discussion. I will see you all on the April forecast. And just for the record, for those of you who happen to be coming to the Portuguese International Conference on the Azores Islands, I will see you there. I will be there the weekend of March 31st, April 1st, and April 2nd, but I will have an April overview forecast out on April 1st, and I look forward to seeing you all then. That's it for now. I'm Rick Levine. Think cosmically, and as always, act locally.